In the past 32 years, the annual trade growth rate in China reached 16.3%, and the trade volume in China increased 144 times. So by the time of 2010, the trade-dependent ratio in China is about 65% of the GDP.
It's not an overstatement. It's not an overstatement to say that Dr. Lin is one of the foremost and, in my opinion, most interesting economic thinkers today. Dr. Lin brings a unique contribution and perspective to the field of development economics and politics. Dr. Lin's visionary thought breaks out of the mold of what have been terribly unsuccessful development strategies, often referred to as the Washington Consensus, and proposes instead creative paths forward, based in part on the recent experience of China, that seeks to leverage coordinated strategic government action with market mechanisms. In all of this work, Dr. Lin is guided by what I observe as a sincere personal stake in lifting millions of people out of poverty. What I see in Dr. Lin's work is a genuine commitment to improving the conditions of millions of our brothers and sisters living in poverty in the developing world. As you all know, of course, Dr. Lin is chief economist of the World Bank, and as such oversees a vibrant research department of over 300 economists and social scientists. He is the founding director and professor of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University, the author of 18 books, including the China Miracle, Development Strategy and Economic Reform, and Economic Development and Transition, Thought, Strategy, and Viability, and most recently, Demystifying the Chinese Economy. And let me say, this is hot off the press, about as hot as you can get. I actually bought my copy this morning from Jack Sella at the Seminary Co-op, the best bookstore in America, at 9:36. Okay, they arrived last night. Fortunately, but when I say he's prolific, I really mean it. Also, there are two other books that have just come out. One of them, literally, I think we saw the boxes for them at the Political Science Department. New Structural Economics, a framework for rethinking development and policy, and Dialogues on Methodology in Economics. In his work, Dr. Lin is pushing the field of economics forward out of its isolationist box, forward and back in some sense towards a realm of political economy and administration. That's very important for the discipline of economics if it is going to survive this period of crisis, survive in a needed, transformed way, to become once again the study of political economy. This makes it particularly appropriate also that Dr. Lin would present the Leonard D. White Memorial Lecture, named after the Ernest DeWitt Burton Distinguished Service Professor of Public Administration in the Political Science Department. Professor White was himself, like Dr. Lin, a PhD graduate of the University of Chicago, and again, like Dr. Lin, would serve a brilliant career in Washington, D.C. Professor White served as U.S. Civil Service Commissioner in the Roosevelt administration from 34 to 37, later on President Hoover's Committee on Social Trends and on Hoover's commissions on the organization of the executive branch of the government from 48 to 49 and 53 to 55. Throughout this period, from 1920 to 1956, Professor Leonard White taught at the University of Chicago and for several years served as chair of the Political Science Department. This lecture is intended to enrich the field of public administration, and Dr. Lin could not be a more suited recipient of the honor of delivering the Leonard D. White Memorial Lecture. I've gone on for too long, I apologize. We're all here to hear you, Dr. Lin, but let me close with one thought. It's my understanding that Lin Yifu, the name that Dr. Lin embraced, represents a Confucian reference to what means a persistent man on a long journey. So I'm delighted that today we can be on that journey with you. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me back to the International House. And as mentioned, I lived in International House for 4 years. From the first day I arrived in the University of Chicago until the last day I got my PhD degree and I left home. So it's always a very good memory to come back to the iHouse. And as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to present the 3 new books I just published to the library here as a token of my appreciation. Certainly, it's a great honor for me to give the Leonard White Memorial Lectures. I understand Professor White was a founding member of the field of public administration in the US. And he made important contribution to the theory of the public administration, but he himself also contributed a lot to the administration in the US. The talk today I'd like to cover is about the economic development in China. But in a way, it is related to the public administration because I think the government need to play a very important role in the process of economic development and transition in the developing countries, certainly also in high-income countries like the US. We know that China started its economic reform in 1979. And since then, the economic performance in China, if we want to find a word to describe that, it should be miracle. Because in 1978, the per capita income in China was only $182 at that time. And it was only about 1/3 of the per capita income in sub-Saharan African countries, only 1/3 of the average there. But in the past 32 years, the average annual growth in China reached 9.9%, and the economic size in China increased 20.5 times. And in 2010, the per capita income in China now was 4,376 according to the World Bank data. And certainly China now is a high middle income country. And the per capita income in China today is about 4 times of the per capita income of the average in the sub-Saharan African countries. From this 1/3 to now, about 4 times. And in this process, it's reform of the economy, and it's also opening up of the economy. Because in 1978, China was a very inward-looking country, measured by the trade as a percentage of GDP, export plus import as a percentage of GDP, the so-called trade-dependent ratio. In 1979, it was only 9.5% of the GDP. But in the past 32 years, the annual trade growth rate in China reached 16.3%. And the trade volume in China increased 144 times. So by the time of 2010, the trade-dependent ratio in China is about 65% of the GDP. And among the large economy, the so-called large economy is a country with a population of more than 100 million. Chinese economy was most open by that measurement. Because for the US, the trade-dependent ratio is only about 25%. And in Japan, it's only about 20%. But China now, 65%. And during these 32 years, it was a dramatic structural transformation in the Chinese economy. Because when the reform started in 1979, 80% of the population lived on agriculture. But now we know China is the world workshop of manufacturing products. China is the largest exporter in the world and the second largest economy in the world. And in the past 32 years, more than 600 million people got out of poverty. We know that United Nations has 1 Millennium Development Goal, and the number one goal was to reduce the number of poverty by half in the year 2015. But China alone made that goal achieved several years ago already. And China not only contribute to the welfare of the Chinese people. In effect, China also made a very important contribution to the global economy. For example, in 1998, during the East Asian financial crisis, because China did not devalue its currency and also maintain dynamic economic growth, avoid the competitive devaluation and brought the stability to the East Asian economy and also its dynamic economic growth, help East Asia economies to recover, only 2 years after the crisis. And the other one is this time the global economic crisis. Because of the dynamic economic growth in China, China is the driving force for the global recovery. But I'd like to say this achievement is out of everyone's expectation. Because even up to the year 2000, or the beginning of 2000, 2001, one of the most popular books was The Coming Collapse of the Chinese Economy. Even after more than 20 years of very dynamic growth in China, but people still think that the Chinese economy was going to collapse anytime. And this performance was not even anticipated by Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's economic reform and opening up strategies. Because for Deng Xiaoping, in late 1970s, early 1980s, the target he set for the Chinese economic development was to quadruple the Chinese economies in 20 years. The so-called quadruple the Chinese economy in 20 years means, on the average, each year China should grow at about 7.2% per year. In effect, most people in the 1980s, even in the 1990s, could not believe a large country like China could sustain the 7.2% growth rate continuously for 20 years. But as I mentioned, now China achieved 9.9% growth rate continuously for 32 years. And this 2.7% difference, in effect, make a large difference. Because if Chinese economy only grew at 7.2% per year for 32 years, the Chinese economic size will increase 9.2 times. But because our China grew at 9.9%, the economic size in China now increased 30.5 times, more than double of the original target. And my talk today, I'd like to discuss a few questions. The number one question is how come China could achieve such a dynamic economic growth? How could it be possible to have 9.9% growth rate for such a long time? And my second question is that how come China could not have similar growth rate before the reform started in 1979? And certainly the answer might be China started the reform. Then my question is that how come other countries also started their reform in the 1980s, 1990s? like those countries in Eastern European countries, former Soviet Union, or in Latin America country, they could not have similar economic growth rate. And then my first question is that, what kind of cost China paid for this remarkable growth performance? And my fifth question is that, how long China can maintain such kind of dynamic economic growth? How long China can maintain that? 5 years, 10 years, or more? And then my last question is that, can other developing countries achieve similar economic growth performance as China? And that is very important for me because now I'm the chief economist of the World Bank, and I need to promote growth in other developing countries. Okay, why it was possible? We know that before the modern times, before the 18th century, according to economic historians, the economic growth was extremely sluggish. For example, according to Angus Madison, the average annual growth rate of per capita income in Western European country, now the high-income country, before the 18th century, their average annual growth rate of per capita income was only 0.05% per year. That means what? It took 1,400 years to double per capita income. And then entered into the 19th century, the rate of per capita income growth increased 20 times to 1% per year. And then it took about 70 years to double per capita income. And entering into the 20th century, it doubled again, from 1% per year to about 2% per year. And then it means that every 35 years, the per capita income in the high-income part, Western European country, North America, will double every 35 years. And how come there's such a dramatic changes from 1,400 years, reduced down to 70 years, now 35 years? Certainly, everyone knows it was because of industrial revolution, and the rate of technological changes accelerated, make the productivity enhancement accelerated, income growth accelerated. And if technological changes is the key for sustained dynamic economic growth, for the low-income country, they can have some kind of advantage of backwardness. Because for the high-income country on the global technological frontier, any new technological changes should come from their own invention with a lot of cost and risk. But as a developing country, their technology is within the global technological frontier. So they can benefit from adopting, absorbing, borrowing technology from advanced countries to achieve technological innovation. And those kind of advantage of backwardness means the cost of innovation, the speed of innovation could be much faster. And in effect, after the Second World War, there are 13 economies in the world. They tap into that potential and achieved 7% or more annual growth rate continuously for 25 or more years. Certainly those including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and others. And I'd like to say China becomes one of those 13 economies after the reform started in 1979, tapping into the potential of advantage of backwardness, accelerate the technological innovation, and also China could achieve the remarkable growth rate of 9.9% continuously for 32 years. Then the question arises again. If the advantage of backwardness was the secret, was the reason for China to have such a remarkable performance after 79, the advantage of backwardness was there forever, right? For a long time, for several centuries. And how come China did not tap into that potential before 1979? Well, it was because of the development strategy that China adopted. We know that the socialist government took over China in 1949. And one of the goals of the government certainly was to modernize China. And the goal at that time was to catch up, to overtake United Kingdom in 10 years, and to catch up the United States in 15 years. So the idea at that time was that China is a low-income country, wanted to modernize its nation. China needed to develop the most modern technologies, industries, in order to compete with the high-income country, advanced country. But there are several issues. The first one that if China wanted to develop those kind of most modern industries, all the technology was still under the protection of patent. If China wanted to get them, then need to pay a very high cost. More importantly, most of those kind of technology and industries were considered as foundation of national security. So the Chinese government won't be able to get that. So if China wanted to develop those kind of modern industry, China needed to reinvent the wheel at a very high cost. And more importantly than that was, those kind of industry were very capital intensive. But China was a capital skills agrarian economies. And those kind of industries were not China's competitive advantages. Firm in an open market system were not viable. If China wanted to develop those kind of industries, their investment as well as their continuous operation rely on the government subsidies and protections. And the way to subsidize them, in general, came from giving them monopoly or distorted interest rate, exchange rate, and so on, to allow them to have access to cheap inputs. And those kind of distortion cause several issues. The first one is misallocation of resources. Although China was able to test the nuclear weapon in 1960s, launched a satellite in the 1970s, but resources were misallocated from the sector that China had competitive advantages to sectors that China did not have competitive advantages. So it's very inefficient. And also those kind of distortion replaced incentive, create opportunities for rent seeking and so on. And as a result, certainly, although China could have those kind of modern industry, but economic efficiency was very low. And that was the reason why China did not perform well before 1979. And only after the reform started in 1979, China started to develop light manufacturing sectors. For example, I came to Chicago in 1982, and I went to the grocery store, I went to the Walgreens and so on, and it's very hard for me to find any kind of product produced in China. But now if I go to any supermarket, most of the products were produced from China. And they were in general very labor intensive. And those kind of industry, those kind of products were consistent with the competitive advantage of Chinese labor-abundant economies. And because they were consistent with China's competitive advantages, they are very competitive. And they can, be competitive in domestic market and international market, and they can generate a high profit. And with high profit, China can make more investment. So capital factors, capital endowment will increase. And with the increase in the capital endowment, China can upgrade its industry and technologies. And in this upgrading, China can benefit from the advantage of backwardness. So that's the reason why that before the reform, China did not perform well. Only after the reform, China did well. But if the change in the development strategies was the main reason for the remarkable performance in China, we know that all the socialist countries follow similar strategies, develop heavy industry, modern industries after the Second World War. But not only China, basically all the developing countries after the Second World War follow similar strategies, the so-called import substitution strategy under the structuralism and so on. They all wanted to develop modern industry, not only in China, but also in Latin America, in Africa. Certainly, they all encounter similar problems as in China, incentive issue, resource allocation issue. And as a result, they did not perform well, and they started a reform in the 1980s, 1990s. But the issue is that other countries, when they engaged in the reform, according to the empirical evidence by some economists, for example, Bill Easterly, and he found that for the developing country, their economic performance in the 1980s and 1990s, in terms of the economic growth rate, was lower in the 1980s and 1990s compared to the 1960s and 1970s. Not only the average growth rate was lower, their economy became more volatile compared to the period in the 1960s and 1970s. And so the Bill Easterly and some other economists call the 1980s, 1990s was the lost decades of the developing country. And how come that they all engage in reform with a similar goal to deviate from the older development strategy to a strategy which is more along the line of market competitive advantages, but other developing countries did not perform equally well? Again, it related to the strategy, the transition strategies. Because in the 1980s, 1990s, when other countries engaged in the reform, they followed the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus, the idea was for the country to have good economic performance, they need to have a well-functioning market system. And the way to have a well-functioning market system, they need to privatize their state-owned sectors. They need to liberalize their market. And they also need to stabilize their macroeconomic policies. And those were trying to address the distortion in the past with a good intention. However, these kind of strategies forgot all those distortions in the past. In a way, are endogenous, in a way, were designed with the purpose to protect the firms which are not viable. The firm in the old priority heavy industry, capital-intensive sectors. And if those kind of distortions were eliminated immediately, according to the Washington Consensus, was the so-called shock therapy, Big Bang approach, all those firms are going to go bankrupt. And it would create a huge unemployment and a social stability issue and political stability issue. Without political stability, social stability, certainly you cannot have economic growth. And in general, politicians fulfill those kind of consequences. Even after they were advised to implement the Washington Consensus reform, in general, they continue to introduce other disguise, subsidies and protections. And in effect, those kind of disguised subsidy and protection, use economic jargon, was that they forced the institution from the second best, deteriorated down to third or fourth or fifth best. As a result, a lot of firms in the older sectors, with those kind of disguised protection, certainly they can survive. But the subsidies to them increased instead of reduced. And that happened in Russia and so on. And so certainly, because of that, their economic performance was even worse than they used to be. But for China, China adopted a very pragmatic approach to the reform. At the beginning, with the understanding of the old sectors, without government protection, they cannot survive. So the government continued to provide some transitory, necessary protection and subsidies. But at the same time, China liberalized the entry to the new sectors which are consistent with China's comparative advantages in the labor-intensive, in the agricultural sectors. By this way, China achieved stability and dynamic economic growth simultaneously. And the dynamic economic growth will create a condition to reform the older sectors. So those kind of more pragmatic, gradual approach allow China to have the performance of 9.9% growth rate, as I just described. But certainly, everything has two sides. This kind of dual-track, gradual approach allows China to achieve stability and dynamic economic growth. But there are also other consequences, and the major consequence demonstrated in the widening of income disparities. When China started the reform, China was quite an egalitarian society. Measured by Gini coefficient, it was only about 0.3. But now, with 32 years of very dynamic economic growth, the Gini coefficient in China reached about 0.45, 0.46, close to the level in the Latin America countries. And this kind of widening in income disparities certainly will cause a lot of social resentment. And the second one is disparity between saving and consumption. China had extremely high saving. Consumption as a percentage of GDP declined continuously from 60% of the GDP in the early 1990s, now down to only about 35% of Chinese GDP. But in terms of saving, I'd like to say about half of the saving came from household. The other half of the saving came from big corporation, large corporation. And the third one related to trade imbalances. China enjoys huge trade surplus and contribute to certainly the global imbalances. And I'd like to say, this kind of imbalances, its root cause was because of China adopted the dual-track approach to transition. I mentioned at the beginning of the transition, China continued to subsidize the older sectors. And the way to subsidize them mainly now in three areas. One is in the financial sectors. The Chinese financial system is dominated by 4 large state banks and equity markets. And those kind of large state banks and equity market were designed to provide capital services to the large corporation as a way to help them to subsidize them. And in general, the interest rate, the capital cost were reduced compared to the level of development in China. And this kind of financial system, because for the large banks, as well as the equity market, only the large companies or rich people can get the services. And in general, the capital cost is reduced. That means what? Other people put the money into the system. In general, those are small firm or ordinary household and so on. They put the money into the system, they cannot get the financial services. And they receive lower return to their saving and so on. And so it's a transfer of wealth from the poor people to the large corporation and rich people. Certainly those kind of financial institutions will contribute to the widening of the income distribution as well as the concentration of the wealth in a large corporation. And this kind of financial system also deprive the financial services to agricultural household, to the small and medium-sized enterprises. In general, they are more labor intensive. They can create more jobs. Because of the financial system, they could not get the services. Their development was retarded. That means what? Job creation was less than desirable, and the wage rate will be replaced by that way. Again, it's a subsidy to the large corporation. And that is the one main reason for the income disparity and the concentration of wealth in a large corporation. In addition to that, there are some other areas. For example, natural resources are owned by the state. But for the company who have access to the mining and so on, the royalty levy is extremely low, almost zero. And it's a transfer of the resources to those kind of mining companies. And it's also a legacy of this kind of dual track reform. And the third one is some kind of monopoly in the services sectors like telecommunication, banking, and so on, and allow them to enjoy the monopoly rent. And with this kind of distortions, it contributes to the income disparities. But we know that rich people, in general, they have lower propensity for consumption. The ordinary poor people, they have higher propensity for consumption. But the ordinary people's income share reduced. Certainly, consumption as a percentage of China's GDP will be reduced. And the wealth concentrated on the rich people and the large corporation, they have high propensity for saving. They will have high propensity for investment also. So that's contribute to the second imbalances in China. And with more saving and investment, but lower consumption absorption domestically, then there's a gap. Those gap turn into the trade imbalances. So for China, to reduce, to eliminate those kind of imbalances, it's very important for China to complete the transition from the old planning economy to the well-functioning market economy by removing those kind of remaining distortion in the Chinese system. My first question, how long that China can maintain this kind of dynamic economic growth, 8 or 9% growth rate? China has achieved for 32 years. How much longer China can maintain that kind of growth rate? And personally, I'm quite optimistic. Although 32 years of 9.9% growth rate itself is a historical record. But it's likely China can maintain 8% growth rate for another 10 or 20 years, likely to be 20 years. And the reason why I think China has the potential to maintain the 8% growth rate for another 20 years, again, it is because of the advantage of backwardness. Because in 2008, the latest data I have, China's per capita income measured by purchasing power parities was 21% of the US per capita income. And the US represents the most advanced country with most advanced technology industries. And it was similar to Japan in 1951. In 1951, Japan's per capita income was 21% of US per capita income. It was similar to Taiwan in 1975. It was similar to Korea in 1977. They all were 21% of US per capita income in those years. For Japan, from 1951 to 1971, its average annual growth rate was 9.2% for 20 years. For Taiwan, from 75 to 95, its annual growth rate was 8.3%. And for Korea, from 1977 to 1997, its average annual growth rate was 7.6%. And we know that Korea, Taiwan, Japan were East Asian economies. they adopt similar development strategies, development pattern. And China joined the same strategies, the same pattern, after the reform started in 1979. With the similar gap to the advanced economies, or the similar gap of advantage of backwardness. If Japan, Korea, Taiwan, those three economies can maintain around 8% growth rate continuously for 20 years, then there's no reason to doubt China has the potential to maintain another around 8% growth rate. And if China can achieve that, I think it would be a very good news for the world economy, because the way out for the current global crisis, the most important thing is to have dynamic economic growth. And China's dynamic economic growth can contribute tremendously to the global sustainable recovery. My last one. While other developing countries in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, has a similar economic performance of 8 or 9% growth rate, continuously for one generation or two generations? My answer is yes, if they have the right policy framework. The first one, they need to develop their economy according to their competitive advantages. If they can develop their economy according to their competitive advantages, then they can tap into the potential of the advantage of backwardness to achieve competitive, at the same time, a very dynamic growth in their industrial upgrading, technological upgrading. Secondly, most countries currently, they all have all different kind of distortion because of wrong intervention in the past. And so they can also learn from some lesson from China. That is, certainly it's very important to eliminate those kind of distortions in order to have a well-functioning market system. However, a lot of distortions are endogenous. They were designed there for a certain purpose. And so it's also very important to have some kind of dual-track approach. If those kind of distortion create some kind of large-scale, non-viable firm, it's desirable to provide certain kind of transitory protections. Allow them to have the stability, but it's also important to open the entry to the new sectors which the country has competitive advantages. Then they can achieve stability and dynamic economic growth. And I'm sure all the countries in the world should have the potential to achieve 8% growth rate and turn from a low-income country to middle-income country or even to a high-income country within one generation or two generations. Thank you very much.
Is this working? Yes? All right. So Dr. Lin has graciously accepted to take some questions after his talk, and I thought I would open it up with two and then open it up to the floor. We'll have mics that we can pass around. It's election season in the United States, as you know, and we're kind of in the political science department here right now. And so one thing that you often hear in election seasons are claims kind of taking credit for or not taking credit for growth, economic growth, or economic recessions. It's kind of conventional. So the question is, and at the same time, I take it, it takes a long time for an economy to move from being oriented towards modern industry, which might not be its competitive advantage, to move towards labor-intensive industries, which might be its competitive advantage. It's a little bit like an aircraft, I suppose. I mean, you can't just turn on a dime. So the question would be, were there reforms or changes in the period prior to '79 that laid the groundwork infrastructurally or somehow that made possible some of that? Or is it really a story of off and on in some sense? That would be my first question.
Well, should I respond?
Yes,
I think that certainly is a good question. With 30 years of old strategy, China certainly built up some heavy industries and technical capacity in those areas. But other countries also with similar, technological capacity like Russia and East European country, but they did not have a similar economic performance as China. So I think those kind of legacies or those kind of endowment, if you use well, certainly contribute. But it's not necessary that you will contribute to the dynamic economic growth. That's one thing. And secondly, if you look into other East Asian economies, like Taiwan or Korea and Singapore, they did not have those kind of distortion to build up a technological capacity. But at the same time, they also maintain dynamic economic growth for one generation, two generations, for not very low income basis. And now they become, advanced economies with high income status. So that means that those kind of legacy, it's not necessary for a low income country to tap into the potential of the advantage of backwardness and to achieve dynamic economic growth for several decades. So my response is that to be pragmatic, if you have that, good, use those kind of legacy well, then it contribute. But it's not necessary to have that to achieve good performance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you was about the concept of competitive advantage, which is very important. It has a ring of naturalness to it, as if a factual element, as if there is a competitive advantage that is somehow that we can all observe. At the same time, though, your theoretical structure involves significant state intervention to manipulate, to affect and to manipulate competitive advantage over time. And so, when we think of China, we think, well, yes, labor intensive, sure. Yep. There's lots of people in China. But labor intensive, there are a lot of people in America, who don't have jobs.
Yeah.
Right? And so what converts kind of millions of people in China into a natural, factual competitive advantage and millions of people in America into not labor-intensive? You see what I'm saying? So it's kind of it's a tension between kind of this naturalness of this idea that it exists, but also the fact that you seem very willing to suggest that there's a role for shaping all of this.
Yeah. Well, here that a competitive advantage is always rely on comparison. Certainly, U.S. with close to 300 million populations, you also have a lot of labor force. But you have been developed for 5 centuries already, and you accumulate a lot of capitals. So your capital stock per workers per person was much higher than other low-income countries like China. China, have 1.3 billion population. And China did not enter into the dynamic economic growth, modern economic growth, until last half a century. So the capital accumulation in China was much smaller than the U.S. And as a result, the capital per worker in China was much smaller. And that's the reason why China had competitive advantages in the more labor-intensive and the sector which use less capital per worker. But in the U.S., although you have a huge labor supply also, but you also have a huge capital endowment. And as for the U.S., you need to go to the sector which certainly need to employ workers, but at the same time, each worker can use a lot more capital And that means they are in the more capital-intensive sectors. That's one thing. Secondly, competitive advantages. Paul Samuelson once had a dinner with a mathematician. And he asked Paul Samuelson, among all the economic theory, can you figure out one theory which is not trivial, but which is important? And after several months of thinking, Paul Samuelson replied to him, the economic theory which is not trivial, which are important and not intuitive, is competitive advantages. So it's very important. And then secondly, Paul Samuelson in other occasions say, the way to distinguish a good economist and non-economist is that a good economist believes in competitive advantages. And I'm educated in Chicago, so certainly I want to be a good economist. I believe in competitive advantages.
Sounds natural. Okay, so let's open it up for questions. I saw Professor Dali Young has a question. There's a mic that will be.
Well, thank you, and I very much appreciate Dr. Lin's wonderful talk. So you have 5 components, and I would like to ask you about the last 2 in terms of China's prospects, but also policies for other countries, because you are arguing that other countries should have the right policies. However, as you know, and you mentioned, in fact, Gordon Chang spoke on the coming collapse of China, and as you probably have heard, that he's just revised the deadline for China's collapse to 2012.
2012. Okay.
So the question is also within China, there has been quite a bit of debate about to what extent China is doing right and China is doing wrong. And in your 4th component, when you discuss China's future, you actually make an analogy. It's not based on whether you think China has the right policies. So could you try to elaborate, so sort of what do you think that the problem is many Chinese now feel like the Chinese government is getting certain things wrong. In fact, there may even have been backtracking. Does China have the right? China has done very well in the last 30 years in terms of keeping the growth going, but does China have the right policies for today's China, first of all? Secondly, are there certain unique factors about China? For example, aging is something that no other country has to confront with as abruptly as China has to. So does those kind of factors may make it much harder for China to sustain it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, whether China has the right policy or not, I returned to China in '87, and I've been participating in the policy discussion since then. And each year, you can hear a lot of criticism about the policy in China. But China continued to grow dynamically in the past 24 years when after I returned to China. The issue was that, in general, people use pure ideal market as a reference for a transitional economy like China. That's one thing. Secondly, most people did not have a structural concept. China is a developing country, and most of the theories are developed in advanced country to explain what happened in advanced country. And both have a very important implication to understand the policy in China. If you're in a transition economy, as I mentioned, it's not necessary to remove all the distortion with the best policies, because you have a lot of legacy in the past. They rely on those kind of policy distortion to survive. And if you wanted to remove all those kind of distortion, even if you have the good intention, you are going to cause the collapse of the whole system, as we observe in many East European countries. And as a result, even if you have the intention to remove those kind of distortion, you will come back also other disguised distortion that will be even worse. So under the kind of situation, it's better to face those kind of realities and to find out, the way to protect them, but other way to make growth possible. And the other way to make growth possible also need to take into the consideration of the stage of development. Policy which is relevant for high-income country may not be relevant for the developing country, which I explain a lot in my new book, New Structural Economics. And I think that is the reason why if you participate in a policy discussion, mostly in the academic circles, or even a policy debate domestically, most people will be very critical of the policy adopted by the Chinese government. But in effect, China has performed so well. So that means what? Certainly, China still has many areas for reform. But I think as long as China can be pragmatic, be open-minded to the issues, at the same time, to be keen to identify new opportunities for growth, I am confident that China can maintain stability and dynamic economic growth in the coming years. And that is what I observed in the past 24 years for my personal participation. And I'm also confident in the new leadership because I understand they are all very pragmatic. They are not ideological. They try to understand the trouble, but they also want to understand the new opportunity for growth.
Thank you. I saw some questions on this side. Could you pass the mic in front?
Hi, thank you for coming. I served as a U.S. Army Ranger from 2001 to 2005, and when I came back from Iraq, the reason for us being there didn't make sense to me until I read a book by John Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And in this book, he worked for a private contractor who worked for the World Bank, who worked indirectly for the U.S., to try and get countries to take out loans larger than they could pay back, so the U.S. would have power over these countries. And in the case of Iraq, we couldn't control Saddam Hussein, we couldn't kill him, so we had to send in the military. My question to you is, have you heard of John Perkins? Is any part of his story true? And is there a move for China to take control of the World Bank from the U.S.? I'll end it there. The other question was the U.S. increase in military in the Asia-Pacific region, which was on the news today. Is that a move by the U.S. to contain China? But
good. Thank you. That's great. Terrific political questions.
Yeah, let's
for the World Bank.
I think that you should address this question to Professor Bernard Harcourt. Well, I'm new to the World Bank, so I did not know what, those kind of wrong or project as you just described. But I'd like to say World Bank is a development institution with a good intention to help the developing country. And the World Bank is a knowledge institution, so the World Bank needs to learn from the past, both success and the failures. And for example, the World Bank now understands a lot of useful lessons from developing countries will be very beneficial to other developing countries. So the World Bank now is promoting south-south learning. In the past, the learning is from the north with all the truths and try to implement those truths to the south. And now the World Bank recognizes there's some value to learn from other developing countries. And to facilitate those kind of knowledge exchanges among the developing countries. And certainly, the developed country will also have some useful lesson for the developing country. But developing country can also have some useful lesson for the developing country. So that is the one direction that the World Bank moved into. And the World Bank also wanted to be transparency, to be open. Now we make all the data that available to any researchers. So if you like to study Iraq or Iran or other developing country, now you go to the World Bank website, you can get all the data you like.
All right. Yes, I have a question here, right in front.
Hi, Mr. Lin. My name is Wen Chen, and I'm a fourth-year international student from China, as well as a resident at House. Thank you very much for the talk first. And I have two questions. My first question is, the environment in China has been damaged a lot since the development, since the gate was opened in 1978. But now China is one of the world's biggest investors in clean energy. But at the same time, a lot of the products that China produce is not very well produced. It's not in a good quality. So that also creates a lot of waste in China. So my question is, should China be willing to, should China be willing to sacrifice a little bit economy growth and to actually think about the sustainability environment, and how would China do it, and is there any move in the government, any policy, and would that be actually applied into work?
As I mentioned, that a country in different stages of development. And at this stage, the sector that China has competitive advantages are mainly in the manufacturing sectors. And manufacturing sectors are more energy intensive, carbon intensive. And that is the reason why when you go from agricultural, agrarian economy to the manufacturing sectors, your pollution and so on will be intensified for a certain period. And once you reach the post-manufacturing sector, entering into the service sectors, then it becomes less energy intensive, carbon intensive. And then you can enjoy the good weather, good environment like you have in Chicago. And this kind of situation is not alone in China. We know that London used to be called a foggy city. How come it was so foggy? Because before the 1950s and so on, and they were manufacturing sectors. And so they also made a lot of pollution. But now London, London does not have any manufacturing, only service. So now if you want to find fog in London, it's become very hard. And this is not only in London, Pittsburgh, Munich, Tokyo, and so on. So we need to be a little bit patient. We need to understand countries in different stages of development. And their nature of production are different. And so you cannot use high-income countries, the production structure as a reference to judge the production, the consequence of production in a developing country. That's one thing. But there's no excuse. China certainly needs to improve that. Because many people say environment and global warming has a large externality to cross-boundary to other countries. But China is a continental-sized country. So in effect, all those kind of pollution or global warming consequence will be borne by the Chinese themselves. So that's the reason why Chinese government now put a lot of effort into the development of clean energy, new renewable energy resources and so on. And with that, with those kind of new technologies, I think it's possible to mitigate, although it may not be able to eliminate, but it's possible to mitigate the consequence of the air pollution and so on. And fundamentally, more important is to maintain dynamic economic growth. If China can maintain this kind of growth for another 2 decades, then China is likely to reach post-manufacturing, post-industrialization stages, just like Tokyo or other high-income countries. Once they reach the post-manufacturing sector, manufacturing stages, they go into the services sectors. Then they can have high income as well as clean, good environments. So I think that to maintain is not to sacrifice growth, it's to promote growth and put more effort on the new technology, clean technologies. And so that China can achieve both.
The last question was to demystify yourself, I think.
Well, I think I'm quite transparent, right? All my story has been on the internet and so on. So if you like to know, you can Google my name and you can read a lot of stories. Yeah, some may be right, some may be true, some may be just exaggeration. But basically, I'm a rational person. I think the best way for me to pursue my goal of making a contribution to the development of China, go to Manhattan is the best way, right? Because it has 1.3 billion population, and if I can make 0.1% improvement in the growth rate in a country with 1.3 billion population, it will be a big contribution, right? So in that regard, I'm a rational person.
Well, with that, we would like to thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you very much.